Hi, we continue today in Luke 13 as our writer shifts the scene dramatically as we approach the center of the journey to Jerusalem chiasm, and the topic shifts and it'll be about to return to the issues that we've been looking at from chapter 9 verse 51 forward. As you can see on the right side of the screen, I've left up what we were looking at in the previous videos in chapter 12 of this thematic map through 12:1 to 13:5 around the question of the commitment to discipleship. So we saw at the beginning the connection back to chapter 11 around that, and all these various examples of full commitment to discipleship is required. I continued in the last video past the end of this unit up to the fig tree that isn't fertile to continue to highlight that element of it before we get to here, but it could have been part of this unit here, as we can see. So as we look at the larger structure of the journey to Jerusalem, we're down here, and you can see in this structure, which is from Bailey, which I note down here, the parable of the fig tree is in this number 8 section here, parallel to what we see in chapter 14, and the man with dropsy is in the next section, whereas the lament over Jerusalem is down here. But as we get to this, and as we've shown in a couple of previous videos, there's a lot of intratextual echoing here, which is to say, in a given scene, Luke is expecting readers to be remembering many of the details that we've heard before to compare and contrast what's going on in a given scene with previous ones. That's a very biblical way of doing things, even though Luke is almost certainly not writing from an Israelite perspective, and as I've been suggesting throughout this series, that his audience are young members of the Roman society who are being trained in paideia, the propagandistic form of education that would shape them not only with skills, but to see the Roman Empire as the gift of the gods and their place in it as part of what the gods have ordered the world. And so for that audience, we'll see the question of Jerusalem isn't directly a matter for them, but the question of who you invite to your banquets and the question of social solidarity is. So we'll see here in this sequence what follows in chapter 13 if we start from the fig tree parable or the bent over woman story, and in chapter 14 when we focus on the man with dropsy, which is to say there's two parallel symbolic healings, the bent over woman and the man with dropsy, as well as symbolic parables, the fig tree parable here, but right after the bent woman, the mustard tree and yeast parables. So they form a little chiasm there, as you can simply see the parables around the woman, but there's also this sequence here that flows from the consequences of the theme of give Jerusalem one more chance. It ends with Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. Then we go to chapter 14, where this man with dropsy, for reasons we'll explain when we get there, is symbolic of the elite greed, or as one scholar put it, their sense of being puffed up, the opposite of humility, which is described here as self-importance. And various examples for that. And that will lead into chapter 15, where it begins with tax collectors and sinners and the three stories of lost things. So here in 13, we hear directed, at least symbolically, to Israelites around their relationship with Jerusalem, to non-Israelites. I'm not going to call them Gentiles because it's more specific than that, more specifically people who identify with the Roman Empire and the role of social status. And then in chapter 15, the people who might experience themselves as excluded, like the prodigal son, and yet find themselves welcomed by a symbolic father who doesn't care about the past, but only is glad they've returned. So the point being that if these people don't convert to allow the poor, the blind, etc. to be welcomed in their banquets, well, the community around Jesus that's oriented around the God of Israel will. But that's not all. We can also see that Dennis Ham has shown this chiasm, which overlaps back to 1249 and up through the end of chapter 13. And so that's the point I was trying to make around the common intratextual echoing. If we're echoing words and phrases and images from different places, it won't be surprising that they sometimes fall into these ABC or ABCD CBA patterns, as we've seen so often. Sometimes we see them as simple ABA patterns within a verse, and I'll point out a number of those as we go. So Luke is doing a number of things, both at the macro level here of putting together 11 chapters into a chiasm, and then parts of a couple of chapters, noting that the chapters weren't part of his original structuring or writing. The chapters are put there in the medieval period by copyists to try to keep track of where they were going, and then this sequence into chapters, as we'll see. So as we enter into the story that we're about to enter into in verse 10, I've laid out the intratextual echoes there as one example. I'm not going to do this for every scene. I could do it for every scene, but I really want to highlight what's revealed when we do that, because it's not simply that we've seen other Sabbath healings or other healings of women, which we have, and those are noted here. But some of the language that Luke uses and recent scholarship, which is voluminous on this passage, although noting 20 years ago in one of the earlier articles I read that when that person wrote, there hadn't been anything written on it for a long time, but more recently there's been quite a bit. And so to my benefit and yours, I hope, we can take advantage of recent scholarship. And some of that is to note, for example, a parallel that we would never see without help. That the verb here for she stood up straight, anorthota, is the same verb in Acts for the building up of the ruins of the dwelling of David. And so if we've been wondering about the role of David in the sense of David as a king in what I call the religion of empire, around a Jesus who's certainly celebrating the religion of creation, rejecting the religion of empire, what role is that of David? Well, it's not David as a warrior king, it's David as a symbol of rebuilding Jerusalem. And that's part of what we'll see. That's just one example. As you can just see looking out across this page, there are a number of examples of very similar things within the story. Earlier, indignant here because Jesus cured on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees challenging that earlier. Jesus referring to his opponents as hypocrites, and the challenging on the Sabbath of an example of an ox. And so part of that is repetitious, and in our mind maybe we think that's boring, I've already heard that before, but repetition with difference is one of the keys to how not only Luke works, but how the Bible as a whole works, as scholars of the Hebrew Bible have pointed out a long time ago. So since Luke is working primarily from the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, he's certainly spent many years certainly studying the structure of that, and he incorporates both the structure of Hebrew Bible and the structure of Greco-Roman rhetoric to make his audience feel comfortable with what he's doing. So with that in mind, we'll enter into our story. So we begin here in verse 10. He was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. As Ryan notes, thus occupying the position usually held by scribes. And of course, we've known of him teaching before. I didn't put verse 10 in this scene because it's really a preface for this, but we've certainly known of teaching in the synagogue, certainly in his opening inaugural sermon in Nazareth back in chapter 4 when he read the Jubilee text from Isaiah 61. The synagogue here evokes a number of critical comments. Some scholars have wondered whether the presence of a synagogue, in the sense of a building, as Jesus teaching in one, is anachronistic at the time, and the idea that synagogues weren't known until the 2nd century. But as you can see from my note down below, Ryan suggests otherwise, noting that there were synagogues in 1st century Palestine, but they consisted of two types, the private association type and the public institution, in which anyone can take part, as here. And he notes that in Hellenistic times, synagogues took the place of the city gate as a locus of justice/mercy, as well as, quote, public eminence and personal advancement for members of the elite. And certainly the fact that synagogues were available in the 1st century, I've witnessed directly, at least the synagogue itself, if not the dating, in the town that Mary was from, in Magdala, on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, where just in the early 21st century, when they were digging to build a 10-story hotel, they found the tiles that were the floor of the synagogue, as you can see right here. So there's no doubt that there were synagogues in the area, although this is just somewhere on the way between Galilee and Jerusalem. So at that moment we have our story, and one of our scholars here lays out the many inter and intratextual references, and I put the intratextual ones up in the chart on the right, and we'll look at the intertextual ones as we go, including, as you can see below, Jubilee questions from Deuteronomy and Isaiah, as well as questions about the Sabbath from Exodus as well as Deuteronomy, and the covenant in Genesis and Jubilee in Leviticus 26, as you can see below. So just then, covering over the Greek kaidu, and behold, noting that this is a transition to a new place here. The same scholar I noted earlier, citing Victor Turner, who's a cultural anthropologist, for the various liminal aspects of the story as it's set up here. So the geography is uncertain. The time is the Sabbath, but the Sabbath is a liminal day when normal events are suspended. And the place is a synagogue, but we don't know exactly where. and the social status of the person shifts from being disabled to being described as a slave to being a daughter, so liminal in the sense of transition there. And that has everything to do with, as we were looking at the journey here, as it shifts, as it heads to the last chance for Jerusalem, as I was noting in this sequence here, that this story, along with the fig tree story, represent the last opportunity for Jerusalem to repent and come around, which is to say the city is represented by its leaders, of course. So just then there appeared, and appeared is not in the Greek here, but as Green notes, it portends the materialization of a person otherwise socially invisible. My note has the no verb. A number of scholars here, including James Metzger, who's written very passionately about how in this story and the story of the man with dropsy at the beginning of chapter 14, whether we imagine God's role in the story or Jesus, raises some serious questions for people with disabilities and the disability community. For instance, Jesus never speaks to this woman. He doesn't ask what we might consider consent. He doesn't even know whether she wants to be healed. This is very different than a story that ends with "your faith has saved you." There's no word from her at all. So although she's put at the center of the story, she is not given any voice. And it's really important to note that whether by Luke or by Jesus, she's being used as a symbol here for something beyond her. And so both women and people around the question of people with disabilities have raised important justice questions about how this story is structured, and I don't want to act like those are not important. They are. So appeared a woman, and my note below has not identified my name, leading some to connect her with the woman of Genesis 3, who is not yet Eve. She's not named as Eve until they're outside the garden. The woman in Luke 8:43 to 48 is parallel. We can see there the woman suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. So parallel both in the sense of suffering for a period of time and dealing with Jesus. But as we can see there in verse 44, she came up behind Jesus and touched him. And so she was seeking healing, whereas this woman, as far as we know, is not. Then she's described here, curiously, with a spirit. The New RSV has crippled, but the word asthenias here means weakness or infirmity. It can be a general term for illness, but it doesn't necessarily imply what we would call disease. And certainly the word crippled doesn't necessarily imply disease. A person could be unable to walk or bent over for all kinds of different causes. But whether there's a literal physical cause here or a psychological cause in the life of this woman, that's not the issue. This is all symbolic, as we're going to see here. So the spirit that had crippled her, and yet what we see is not an exorcism, and it's not exactly a healing, it's a liberation, as we'll see in just a minute. So the 18 years has raised a number of issues for people, but the clear reference, it seems to me, are two parallel scenes in Judges. The 18 killed by the tower in the previous scene is probably nothing more than a verbal chaining that is easy to remember the number of years because we just heard 18 before. But let's look quickly at these two passages from Judges so we can see what's at issue. So back here in Judges 3:14, the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years, and they cried out to Yahweh, who raised up Ehud as a judge for them. So a period of captivity under King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. Similarly here in 10:8, and the Philistines crushed and oppressed the Israelites that year. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites that were beyond the Jordan in the land of the Amorites, which is in Gilead. So the 18 years in both those situations from Judges refers to the Israelites being held captive by their local oppressors. And so that's certainly what leads a number of scholars to see her, along with the language we're about to see, as an expression of that solidarity, that she is representing Israel, if not more specifically Jerusalem. She was bent over, and the word for bent over, the verb sunkupto, is only here in the New Testament. It's used a couple of other places as appearance or about the way one walks. It's often seen as an expression of inner character as used in the Septuagint, although this is not about her inner character because we really know nothing about her as a person. She was quite unable to stand up straight. And this is echoing 21:28, as I can put the intratextual echoes back up here as we can see here. So Jesus speaking apocalyptically, when these things begin to take place, stand up as she's standing up, raise your heads, your redemption is drawing near. So at this point, her redemption is drawing near, but at the moment, she's unable to stand up. When Jesus saw her, echoing what we saw with the widow of Nain back here, when the Lord saw her, it also echoes implicitly the question of the Pharisee, Simon the Pharisee, back in chapter 7, do you see this woman? That isn't the issue here. The leader of the synagogue in 14 certainly sees the woman in the sense he sees what Jesus is doing, although he doesn't ever refer to her, so in that sense it's similar. So Jesus saw her, he called her over. Prosponio here, used a number of times. It's normally, though, as a call to discipleship. And here it's parallel to calling the man with the withered hand to the center back in chapter 6. So he calls her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." Notice he doesn't ask her anything. He doesn't touch her right away. She doesn't say anything to him. We don't even know if she's looking at him and sees him or not. He saw her and called her over. It doesn't say whether she came over. Although in verse 13 he laid his hands on her, so she has to be close enough for that. But it's a very distant relationship for something where Jesus does something for her. And the word for set free is meaning set free. It's not the same as throwing out, ekbalo, for throwing out a demon. And sometimes, as we see in the Gerasene story, the demon speaks directly from within the person that's possessed. Here there's no sense that the spirit has any kind of animated force. But as my note below says, the implication is that the asthenia, the weakness, has held the woman captive. She's been bent over by the oppression of the Torah system's application by those in leadership of the synagogue. Its use matches the image of bondage in 13:16 that we'll see in a minute. And so the issue is being set free. We can either see her as a victim of the Jerusalem elite, and those are the same people who will try to oppress Jesus' followers in the book of Acts, or in the larger picture as being captive, as we see in the parable of Judges, by empire, by the Romans in particular. So in that sense, to the extent she's representative of Jerusalem being held captive by the Romans, although the 18 years was not literally how long Judeans were held captive by Romans. But it's echoing the Judges passage, not giving a factual description of the situation with Rome. And so here, ailment, asthenia, again, translating what was translated as crippled up here. So moving along, so when he laid his hands on her, and notice that he lays his hands on her after he's announced that she's set free, although perhaps we can understand this as simultaneous, that as he's saying this, he's laying his hands on her, and immediately she stood up straight. Literally, it's the hand, linking with 5:13, as Scholar May notes here, only in Luke. Which is suggesting, as Bashaw says down here, suggests that this is helping her to stand, given the announcement in verse 12 that precedes the touch. So whether it's seen as helping her, or whether the hand here suggests the hand of God in those couple of places. So that Jesus is operating with the hand of God through his hand. And at once she stood up straight, and that's the word that we see here connected with the David story, and that's the argument we see down here. And began praising, literally glorifying God. Word for praise would be a different word, eulogio, as in a eulogy at a funeral, but began glorifying God, and we see glorifying God throughout. So while she's glorifying God, the leader of the synagogue comes up, and this is at the center of the chiasm that we see as this scene here. And as my note below from May suggests, if verses 10 to 13 demonstrate that Jesus brings in the new creation or reverses the curse of Genesis, then verses 14 to 17 illustrate that the new creation is not acknowledged by everyone. So the leader of the synagogue here, the arche-synagogos here, like Jairus in 849 that we saw back here in 841, the first time he's announced, he speaks to the crowd. So this is clearly an attempt to dishonor or shame Jesus for violating the Sabbath. But it comes out of his feeling here, agonokton, only here in Luke Acts. In other places, it's an expression of anger at the violation of expected behavior. So in other words, he's actually not seeing the woman at all. What he's seeing is Jesus doing something on the Sabbath. And what he sees is Jesus curing, even though that's not what the narrator described as happening here. It was a liberation, as we saw up here. So he perceives it wrongly in terms of therapeuo. And then he says to the crowd, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath. Notice he's not addressing this to Jesus, and he's talking about him, which would also be an insult. As my note below suggests, there are two different rationales for the Sabbath, one in Exodus and one in Deuteronomy. And we need to look at both of those to get a sense of what the competition is here for whether what Jesus did is right or not. So back in Exodus, we see 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. On the 7th day is a Sabbath, so you don't work there. You or your slaves, your livestock, or the alien resident. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth and then rested. So that's the view from Exodus. But in Deuteronomy, we see this. 6 days you should do your labor, and the 7th day is a Sabbath. You shall do no work at all. Remember, you were a slave in the land of Egypt. and the Lord commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So this first part, the 6 days on which you should do the work, and all these parallels are the same in both, but the Exodus has it because of how long it took God to make creation, and Deuteronomy has it because God is a liberator and pulled you out of slavery. So if we take the Deuteronomy perspective, of course, then exactly what you should be doing on the Sabbath is acts of liberation, as Jesus does here. The word for ought here is dei, which is almost always understands divine necessity. And as we see the note down below, the question is not about what one can or cannot do legally on the Sabbath, but rather about what one is obligated to do. And that's the point here, that Jesus is highlighting not that he's violating the Sabbath, he's fulfilling the Sabbath, even though he doesn't use exactly that language. He's doing exactly what the Sabbath was for, to liberate people so they can be free to worship God and live the way that God wants. So again, in his speech, he highlights what he perceived that this is a cure, but it's not. And so now we see in the other side of the chiasm the response. And as Bashaw notes below, when religious men prioritize oppressive tradition over compassion, they can end up treating their animals better than they treat suffering women. And that's the point he's making here. And the narrator calls him Lord here to highlight his authority in the face of the head of the synagogue. You hypocrites, and we've seen hypocrites a couple of times earlier around seeing this speck in your neighbor's eye but not the log in your own, and we also saw it around interpreting the earth and sky but not how to interpret the kairos, the present time. So here's a similar hypocrisy. You care for your animals, but you don't care for human beings. And notice the similarity of language here. Does not each of you on the Sabbath untie, or literally set free, their ox or their donkey? Following Parsons, there's evidence the ox was a symbol for negative traits such as cowardice and sluggishness and stupidity. We'll see at the end of the chapter Herod called a fox, and we'll see other examples of the question of symbolic animals and plants as we go. So if you can unleash a dumb ox on the Sabbath, or a donkey from its manger, curiously evoking the manger in which Jesus was born, or at least cared for as a baby, and lead it away to water, ought not. And notice the contrast with the synagogue leaders ought. 6 days where work ought to be done, but Jesus, you ought not this woman be set free. Notice he's not claiming his authority. He's claiming that the act of setting her free is what ought to be done on the Sabbath. In other words, as we just saw, as an obligation of the Sabbath, not a question of a legal violation. And then he calls her a daughter of Abraham, parallel to Zacchaeus later as a son of Abraham. But this brings up all kinds of intertextual references, and I'm already going a little long, so I won't get to all of those. But the image probably results from linking Isaiah 45:11, questioning me about my children, with Isaiah 51:2, consider your father Abraham and Sarah who birthed you. And as the note following from that has, while Isaiah 51:1-13 is originally given as a promise of God's future deliverance, the straitened woman constituted a present reality of the vindication of God's name and people. And that might implicitly have a return to Eden theme too, a return to God's original plan for humanity and all of creation. So as daughter of Abraham, we see Abraham a number of times, and we'll see Abraham in chapter 16 in the bosom of Abraham. And now we hear Satan again. So this is described not as some unclean spirit generically, but as Satan specifically. And as Vincent notes, Luke is clear that Satan, not the law, bound the woman. And again below, only here is Satan described as a captor of a human being. That Satan bound her, Deo here, only 19:13 elsewhere in Luke, which is a so-called secular one about binding a donkey. But we see how it's around in Acts a number of places of people being bound by evil forces, what Luke sees as evil forces. So it's very similar to the use here, bound to the course of empire. For 18 years here, the long years is literally look, 18 years, highlighting the chiastic parallel with the 18 years in the beginning. So ought not this woman to be set free or loosened, as we saw earlier, from this bondage? Notice the bound and from this bondage here on the Sabbath day. And so they don't respond, and they won't respond either in chapter 14 around the man with dropsy, and we'll look more in more detail about refusing to respond. But his opponents here, only here in 21:15 in the Gospels, this word ante menoi here. But notice what echoes from Zechariah 3:1 is Satan. standing at the right hand to accuse, as the opponent, using this Greek word here to describe Satan. So in other words, if we put the intertextual reference to Zechariah with what we have in Luke 21 and here in 13:17, we can see the opponents are precisely working under the guise of Satan, whether they know it or not, in refusing to be on Jesus' side. And they were put to shame. So the synagogue leader who was trying to shame Jesus for violating the Sabbath now finds that he and all those who support him are put to shame. We don't know who the others are, but then we hear that all of the crowd that are here, the ones that he addressed, that the synagogue leader addressed, rejoiced at the wonderful things that Jesus was doing. The word for wonderful is here and only in 7:25, and we can look back and see there. What did you come to see? Someone dressed in luxury there, in wonderful clothing. But we can also see it from Exodus 34:10 about the awesome things that God will do. So that word is often used, and doxos here, and again in Deuteronomy, for what God has done. So all the wonderful things, or literally what was becoming by him that he was doing, the crowd is rejoicing. So at the end of this scene here, we find that the crowd is at least rejoicing with Jesus. They're not signing up to be disciples. Perhaps that's similar to what we saw in chapter 4 when they celebrated the wonderful words he said, but when he spoke to them directly, they wanted to throw him off a cliff. So we don't hear anything further from the crowd, and he will continue to talk, and we still won't hear further from the crowd, but he'll give further examples of what this woman represents as we continue to explore the future of Jerusalem from the perspective of Luke's Jesus. Enough for today. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.